This audio is recorded by John Lothe. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 12. The Italian Assault, 1934 to 1936. Although the fascist government of Benito Mussolini talked in a truculent and vainglorious way from its accession to power in 1922, emphasizing its determination to re-establish the glories of the Roman Empire, to dominate the Mediterranean Sea, and to achieve strategic self-sufficiency by increasing the quantity of homegrown food, its actions were much more modest and did not go far beyond efforts to limit Yugoslav influence in the Adriatic and to overly publicize a modest increase in domestic wheat production. In general, Italy's situation was similar to Japan's: limited natural resources, especially an almost complete lack of coal or oil, combined with a rapidly falling death rate to create growing pressure of population. This problem, as in Japan, was intensified by restrictions on the immigration of Italians or on the outflow of Italian goods, especially after 1918. The important dates in modern Italian history are 1922, 1925, 1927, and, above all, 1934. In 1922, the fascists came to power in a parliamentary system. In 1925, this parliamentary system was replaced by a political dictatorship, with 19th century Latin American overtones rather than a 20th century totalitarian character, since the economic system remained that of orthodox financial capitalism. In 1927, an orthodox and restrictive stabilization of the lira on the international gold standard led to such depressed economic conditions that Mussolini adopted a much more active foreign policy, seeking to create an economic and political entente with the three defeated powers of Central Europe: Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria. In 1934, Italy replaced orthodox economic measures by a totalitarian economy functioning beneath a fraudulent corporative facade, and, at the same time, shifted its dynamic foreign policy from Central Europe to Africa and the Mediterranean. The Italian drive to build up a political and economic bloc in Central Europe in the period 1927 to 1934 was both anti-German and anti-Little Entente. This was an impossible combination, for the division of Europe into revisionist and anti-revisionist powers made it impossible for Italy to create a new alignment, cutting through this line of conflict. By following an Little Entente and pro-Hungarian policy, Mussolini was anti-French, and thus inevitably pro-German, something which Mussolini never was and never wished to be. It took him 7 years, however, to realize the illogic of his position. In these 7 years, 1927 to 1934, Hungary, rather than Germany, was the most active revisionist force in Europe. By working with Hungary, with the reactionary elements in Austria and Bulgaria, and with dissident Croatian elements in Yugoslavia, Mussolini sought to weaken the Little Entente, especially Yugoslavia, and to create troubled waters for fascist fishing. He insisted that Italy was a dissatisfied power because of its disappointment over its lack of colonial gains at Versailles in 1919. And the refusal of the League to accede to Tommaso Tedoni's request for a redistribution of the world's resources in accordance with population needs, made in 1920. It is true that Italy's population and raw material problems were acute, but the steps taken by Mussolini offered no hope of alleviating them. Italy's Danube policy culminated in a treaty of friendship with Austria in 1930, and a series of political and economic agreements with Austria and Hungary known as the Rome Protocols in 1934. The Austrian government, under Engelbert Dollfuss, destroyed the democratic institutions of Austria, wiped out all socialist and working-class organizations, and established a one-party, dictatorial, corporative state at Mussolini's behest in February through April 1934. Hitler took advantage of this to attempt a Nazi coup in Austria, murdering Dollfuss in July 1934. But he was prevented from moving into the country by a hurried mobilization of Italian troops on the Brenner frontier, and a stern warning from Mussolini. This significant event revealed that Italy was the only major power prepared to fight for Austria's independence, and that Mussolini's 7 years of work for the revisionist cause had been a mistake. It was, however, a mistake from which the Duce learned nothing. Instead, he condoned an assassination plot by extreme revisionist elements, including the Bulgarian MIRO, Croatian separatists, and Hungarian extremists. This resulted in the murder of Alexander, the centralist Serb king of Yugoslavia, and Jean-Louis Barthou, the foreign minister of France, at Marseilles in October 1934. Hitler's ascension to office in Germany in January 1933 found French foreign policy paralyzed by British opposition to any efforts to support collective security or to enforce German observation of its treaty obligations by force. As a result, a suggestion from Poland in April 1933 was rejected by France. Poland at once made a non-aggression pact with Germany and extended a previous non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, January through May 1934. This inaugurated a policy of balancing between these two great powers, which left Poland ripe for the Fourth Partition, which came in 1939. After the ascent to office in France of a new conservative coalition government with Jean-Louis Barthou as foreign minister in February 1934, France began to adopt a more active policy against Hitler. This policy sought to encircle Germany by bringing the Soviet Union and Italy into a revived alignment of France, Poland, the Little Entente, Greece, and Turkey. A Balkan Pact of Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey was concluded as early as February 1934. French relations with the Little Entente were tightened as a consequence of visits by Barthou to the various capitals. Russia was brought into the League of Nations in September 1934. A French-Italian agreement was signed in January 1935. A common front against German rearmament, which had been announced in March, was made by France, Italy, and Britain at the Stresa Conference in April 1935, and Germany's action was denounced by the League of Nations the same week. A French-Soviet alliance and a Czech-Soviet alliance were made in May 1935. The latter to be binding on Russia only after the earlier French-Czech alliance went into effect. In the course of building this united front against Germany, but before Italy had been brought into it, Barthou and King Alexander were assassinated at Marseilles, as we have indicated, October 1934. This did not stop the project, for Pierre Laval took Barthou's place and carried out his predecessor's plans, although much less effectively. It was, accordingly, Pierre Laval who brought Italy into this arrangement in January 1935 and the Soviet Union in May 1935. Laval was convinced that Italy could be brought into the anti-German front only if its long-standing grievance and unfulfilled ambitions in Africa could be met. Accordingly, Laval gave Mussolini 7% of the stock of the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway, which ran from French Somaliland on the Red Sea to the capital of Ethiopia, a stretch of desert 114,000 square miles in extent, but containing only a few hundred persons, 62, according to Mussolini himself, on the border of Libya, a small wedge of territory between French Somaliland and Italian Iteria, a settlement of the citizenship and education status of Italian immigrants in French Tunisia, and the right to ask for concessions throughout Ethiopia. This last point was an important one because, while Laval insisted that he had made no agreement which jeopardized Ethiopia's independence or territorial integrity, he made it equally clear that Italian support against Germany was more important than the integrity of Ethiopia in his eyes. France had been Ethiopia's only real friend in many years. It had engineered a tripartite agreement of Britain, Italy, and France to permit no change in Ethiopia's status without tripartite consent in 1906, and had brought Ethiopia into the League of Nations over British objections in 1923. Italy, on the other hand, had been prevented from conquering Ethiopia in 1896 only by a decisive defeat of her invading force at the hands of the Ethiopians themselves. While in 1925, Britain and Italy had cut Ethiopia up into economic spheres by an agreement which was annulled by a French appeal to the League of Nations. Laval's renunciation of France's traditional support of Ethiopian independence and integrity was thus of great importance and brought the three governments concerned, Italy, Britain, and France, into agreement on this issue. This point of view, however, was not shared by public opinion in these three countries. In France, opinion was too divided to allow us to make any categorical statements about its nature, but it is probable that a majority was in favor of extending collective security to Ethiopia, while an overwhelming majority was convinced that Germany should be the primary object of this instrument of international action. In Italy, it is likely that a majority opposed both Mussolini's war on Ethiopia and the League's effort to stop this by economic sanctions. In England, an overwhelming majority was in support of the League of Nations and sanctions against Italy. This was clear from the so-called Peace Ballot of 1935, which, on the basis of a privately conducted straw vote of the English electorate, showed that, of 11.5 million polled, over 11 million supported membership in the League, over 10 million supported economic sanctions, and over 6.7 million supported, while only 2.3 million opposed, military sanctions against aggressors. This point of view was opposed by the pacifist left wing of the Labour Party and by the imperialist right wing of the Conservative Party. It was also opposed by the British government itself. Sir John Simon, the Foreign Secretary, Sir Bolton Aries Monsell, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Stanley Baldwin, leader of the party and Prime Minister, denounced the peace ballot and its collective security bases while the polling was in process, but hastened to give their verbal support as soon as the results became evident. Baldwin, who in November 1934 had declared that a collective peace system was perfectly impracticable, assured the organizers of the ballot that the foreign policy of the government is founded upon the League of Nations, when the results were revealed in January 1935. On this basis was erected one of the most astonishing examples of British dual policy in the appeasement period. While publicly supporting collective security and sanctions against Italian aggression, the government privately negotiated to destroy the League and to yield Ethiopia to Italy. They were completely successful in this secret policy. The Italian aggression against Ethiopia began with an incursion into Ethiopian territory at Walwal in December 1934, and broke into full-scale invasion in October 1935. That Italy had no real fear of British military sanctions against them was evident when they put a major part of their military forces, transports, and naval strength in the Red Sea, separated from home by the British-controlled Suez Canal and the massed British fleet at Alexandria. Their use of the Suez Canal to transport munitions and troops naturally revealed their aggressive intentions to Britain at an early stage. The British government's position on Ethiopia was clearly stated in a secret report of an interdepartmental committee under Sir John Maffei. The report presented to the Foreign Secretary on June 18, 1935, declared that Italian control of Ethiopia would be a matter of indifference to Britain. This report was mysteriously and surreptitiously conveyed to the Italians and undiplomatically published by them later. There can be no doubt that it represented the opinion of the British government, and that this opinion was shared by the French government. Unfortunately, public opinion in both countries and throughout most of the world was insisting on collective sanctions against the aggressor. To meet this demand, both governments engaged in a public policy of unenforced or partially enforced sanctions at wide variance with their real intentions. In consequence, they lost both Ethiopia and Italy, the former by their real policy, the latter by their public policy. In the process, they gave the League of Nations, the collective security system, and the political stability of Central Europe their death wounds. Taking advantage of the wave of public support for collective security, Samuel Hoare, now Foreign Secretary, went to the meeting of the Assembly of the League of Nations in September 1935 and delivered a smashing speech to support of the League, collective security, and sanctions against Italy. The day previously, he and Anthony Eden had secretly agreed with Pierre Laval to impose only partial economic sanctions, avoiding all actions such as blockade or closure of the Suez Canal, which, quote, might lead to war, closed quote. A number of governments, including Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, and Britain, had stopped all exports of munitions to Ethiopia as early as May and June 1935. Although Ethiopia's appeal to the League of Nations for help had been made on March 17th, the Italian attack did not come until October 2nd, 1935. The net result was that Ethiopia was left defenseless in the face of an aggressor who was annoyed, without being sensibly hampered, by incomplete and late economic sanctions. Ethiopia's appeal for neutral observers on June 19th was never acknowledged, and her appeal to the United States for support under the Kellogg-Briand Pact on July 3rd was at once rejected. But Eden found time to offer Mussolini a portion of Ethiopia as part of a deal which would avoid an open Italian aggression, June 24th. The Duce was determined, however, to commit an open aggression as the only method for achieving that modicum of Roman glory for which he thirsted. Hoare's speech in support of collective security at Geneva in September evoked such applause from the British public that Baldwin decided to hold a general election on that issue. Accordingly, with a ringing pledge to support collective action and collective security, and to take no action in isolation, the national government offered itself at the polls on November 14, 1935, and won an amazing victory. The government's margin of 431 seats out of 615 kept it in power until the next general election 10 years later, July 1945. Although Article 16 of the League Covenant bound the signers to break off all trade and financial relations with an aggressor, France and Britain combined to keep their economic sanctions partial and ineffective. Imposed on November 18, 1935, and accepted by 52 nations, these sanctions established an embargo in arms and munitions, on loans and on credit, and on certain key commodities, and established a boycott on purchases of all Italian goods. The embargo did not cover iron ore, coal, or petroleum products, although the last item, of which Italy had less than a 2-month supply in October 1935, would have stopped the Italian aggression quickly and completely. The imposition of oil sanctions was postponed time and again until, by the spring of 1936, the conquest of Ethiopia was completed. This was done in spite of the fact that as early as December 12th, 10 states, which had been supplying 3/4 of Italy's oil needs, volunteered to support the embargo. The refusal to establish this sanction resulted from a joint British-French refusal on the grounds that an oil sanction would be so effective that Italy would be compelled to break off its war with Ethiopia and would, in desperation, make war on Britain and France. This, at least, was the amazing logic offered by the British government later. Instead of additional or effective sanctions, Samuel Hoare and Pierre Laval worked out a secret deal, which would have given Italy outright about 1/6 of Ethiopia, and have yielded an additional 1/3 as a zone of economic expansion and settlement reserved to Italy. When news of this deal was broken to the public by a French journalist on December 10, 1935, there was a roar of protest from the supporters of collective security, especially in England, on the grounds that this violated the election pledge made but a month previously. To save his government, Baldwin had to sacrifice Hoare, who resigned on December 19th, but returned to the cabinet on June 5, 1936, as soon as Ethiopia was decently buried. Laval, in France, survived the first parliamentary assault, but fell from office in January 1936. He was succeeded at the Croix d'Ossé by Pierre Faldin, who pursued the same policy. Ethiopia was conquered on May 2, 1936, and annexed to Italy a week later. Sanctions were removed by the various cooperating states and by the League itself in the next 2 months, just as they were beginning to take effect. The consequences of the Ethiopian fiasco were of the greatest importance. Mussolini was much strengthened in Italy by his apparent success in acquiring an empire in the face of the economic barrage of 52 nations. The Conservative Party in England was entrenched in office for a decade, during which it carried out its policy of appeasement and waged the resulting war. The United States was driven by panic to pass a Neutrality Act, which encouraged aggression by its provision that the outbreak of a war would cut off supplies of American munitions to both sides, to the aggressor who had armed at his leisure, and to the victim yet unarmed. Above all, the Ethiopian crisis destroyed French efforts to encircle Germany. Britain had opposed these efforts from the beginning and was able to block them with the aid of a number of other factors, for which Britain was not primarily responsible. This point is sufficiently important to demand detailed analysis.